When Harry Houdini would come to a seance in disguise, he developed his own superhero tagline, a dramatic moment when he would expose the seance medium and declare, "I'm Harry Houdini and you are a fraud." Well, I'm Marvin Pinkert and I'm trying not to be a fraud, but it isn't easy. Much of what I've learned about Harry Houdini comes from the last year of developing the exhibit Inescapable, the life and legacy of Harry Houdini. The exhibit, curated by magician David London, is the first exhibit to look at Harry Houdini through the lens of Eric Weiss. Weiss is a poor Hungarian Jewish immigrant who created the persona of Harry Houdini and took on that role for the rest of his entire adult life. As we put it at the beginning of the exhibit, Eric Weiss is born, Houdini was invented. And that's probably the biggest challenge in not being a fraud. When talking about Houdini, there are so many stories told about his life, the subject of more than 90 biographies and at least a few major motion pictures, that it's hard to separate fact from fiction. Harder still because the leading forger of Houdini legends was Harry Houdini himself. The exhibit touches on a phase of his career that's less well known. From 1920 till his death in 1926, Houdini devotes an increasing amount of his energy to the task of exposing fakes in the world of spiritualism. As you can see in this poster, it literally becomes part of his act. I'm here tonight to explore with you the puzzling question of why Harry Houdini, a master illusionist, became the leader of the fight against spiritualism in the early 20th century. At first glance, it seems a little strange that someone who made his reputation by fooling people would spend much of the last 6 years of his life pursuing scam artists. But I want to share some of the reasons this is less surprising than you might think. So tonight, I'm telling the story of a messenger and his message. Perhaps the place to begin is with the journey of Samuel Meyer Weiss and family to Appleton, Wisconsin. It's unclear why Weiss left Budapest, but one interesting story claims that Rabbi Weiss got into a duel with a nobleman and accidentally killed him. More likely, Rabbi Weiss, who was trained by one of the most prominent religious reformers in Europe, saw America as an opportunity to pursue his own course. In any case, he is recruited to be the first rabbi of the Appleton congregation, and in 1878 is joined by his wife and 4-year-old son, Eric. Life in Appleton is good, but it doesn't last. 6 years into his tenure, the synagogue dumps the German-speaking Rabbi Weiss and seeks out a rabbi fluent in English. Weiss moves his family to Milwaukee, where failing to find work, he plunges his family into poverty. In 1886, Eric runs away from home, seeking to escape the miserable hardships of life in Milwaukee. He eventually meets up with his ailing father in New York, taking a variety of part-time jobs to keep them both fed. Among these is a job as a telegraph messenger. So this is a photo of 13-year-old Eric Weiss. As the story suggests, young Weiss did not have many years of formal education. He was an avid reader and could be an eloquent speaker, but he was very self-conscious later in life about his poor grammar and awkward writing. There was at least one subject matter in which Weiss was truly grounded, and that was his Jewish education. In his early years, he received Hebrew lessons from his father, who, despite his appearance in this photo, was a Reformed rabbi. And in New York, Eric studied for his bar mitzvah with Rabbi Bernard Drachman, a leader in the American Orthodox movement. At age 16, Weiss finally becomes a bar mitzvah. One of the special artifacts we'll have on display is a Bible that belonged to both Rabbi Weiss and his son. At the Young Men's Hebrew Association, Eric experiments with something new to him. Under the title Eric the Great, he puts on a magic show, and this becomes a lifelong obsession. The following year is one of dramatic change. At this point, both Eric and his father are working in a necktie factory. Eric and his friend Jacob Hyman decide to ditch their jobs at the tie factory and try their hand at show business, putting on performances in the basement of their apartment building and local beer halls. Eric decides that their act should borrow its name from a famous French magician of the early 1800s, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, and the brothers Houdini are formed. He gets his first big break at Coney Island, performing a trick he called METAMORPHOSIS, in which he is locked in his trunk with his brother standing on top. A curtain is raised and dropped, and in the blink of an eye, the brothers switch places. It is at Coney Island where the Houdini brothers, who were not brothers, meet a song and dance trio known as the Floral Sisters, who were not sisters. Houdini falls in love with one of the sisters, Wilhelmina Beatrice Ranner, better known as Bess. In his final stage of metamorphosis, he marries Bess, substitutes her for Jacob, and the Houdini brothers become simply the Houdinis. Harry and Bess take their show on the road. One of the most interesting elements in this very early stage of his career is Houdini's dalliance with spiritualism. He turns Bess into a medium. Note who gets the largest billing on this poster. He portrays himself as a great occult demonstrator. He very soon drops this act. He will later tell a story about being confronted by a grieving parent after a performance that caused him to question the morality of the act. Whether that's true or not, or just more Houdini legend, I would note that unlike many of his contemporaries, even when he was playing the faker, he never wraps his act in religion. It's billed as spiritualistic entertainment and as a fashionable event. The truth is that Harry tried just about everything in show business to sustain himself. He worked in vaudeville when he could, and when he couldn't, he put on shows in dime museums, the lowest form of public entertainment in the 1890s, essentially freak shows with actors. He worked medicine shows with snake oil salesmen and did a stint in the Welsh Brothers Circus, which you see here, alternating between his magic act and prancing around the stage as a wild man of Borneo. It wasn't just his dignity that suffered. We'd obtained a copy of his travel journal with the circus as he made his first trip to Maryland in 1898. In Hancock and Cumberland, the journal has a simple entry: no dinner. Harry apparently could only afford to eat every other night. This is 2 years before he's going to achieve fame and fortune, but it was going rather poorly. As the century comes to a close, Harry takes his biggest gamble in a life filled with risk. First, at the encouragement of Martin Beck, founder of the prestigious vaudeville Orpheum circuit, he drops conventional magic and refocuses his act on escapes, billing himself as the king of handcuffs. Then he abandons the steady work he's starting to get in vaudeville to head to England. Though he has no bookings or friends in London, he has an idea. He realizes in 1900 the way to become a headline attraction in America lies in building a reputation in Europe. After studying the handcuffs and locking mechanisms manufactured in England, Germany, and Russia, he spends 4 years traversing the continent, challenging everyone from local police departments to Scotland Yard to keep him in chains. Each piece of public relations makes it more difficult for the next constabulary to refuse his challenge, and Harry's fame grows. He returns to America in 1904 as a celebrity. His presence is truly inescapable. Harry spends much of the decade between 1904 and 1914 upping the ante on his escape tricks, being locked in a crate and thrown in the frozen river, the famous water torture trick, as well as numerous inventive escape challenges like being locked in a milk can. While Harry always tried to make it appear as though the proud police departments and private companies were challenging him, a careful reading of some of the challenges, like this one from a Baltimore brewer, revealed that this would usually begin with Harry writing to the organization and pleading with them to offer him a challenge. And yes, this is a challenge to escape from a barrel filled with beer. But you can see that it begins on account of the numerous requests we have received. Those are requests from Harry. Some of you have noticed in the last few slides, I've started calling Eric Harry. Sometimes a stage name becomes so strongly associated with a person that we make the assumption that their original persona has disappeared. Who knows how much of Richard Starkey or David Kotkin survives in Ringo Starr or David Copperfield. But our exhibit will attempt to pull back the curtain to reveal at least a little of the Eric Weiss that lies behind the very public Harry Houdini. One aspect of this is his extraordinary devotion to his mother. He strives to give her material comforts in her final years that she was denied in the years he was growing up. When she dies in 1913, he puts a tribute on her mausoleum, signed Harry Houdini, and then in parentheses, Eric Weiss. But for me, the most surprising detail that we discovered in developing the exhibit was Harry's efforts to raise money for the Red Cross in World War I. He became president of something called the Rabbi's Sons Theatrical Benevolent Association. He was joined by Al Jolson as vice president and Irving Berlin as secretary. Together and separately, the group raised money to benefit those injured in the war. Houdini has become something more than a vaudeville celebrity. He has become a public citizen. And it is this civic stature that allows him to take on one final challenge, the Spiritualists. The story of spiritualism in America goes back to 1848, nearly 40 years before Eric Weiss was born, to the town of Hydesville, New York, where strange things are happening in the Fox sisters' bedroom. Mysterious cracking noises are heard that are interpreted as messages from the great beyond. What starts as a family curiosity begins to attract the attention of neighbors. The sisters open up their home to allow visitors to witness the strange phenomenon, for a fee, of course. Years later, one of the sisters would first admit and then recant that the noises were more about a talent for cracking bones than anyone's departed relatives. But whatever the technique, they soon had many imitators. And spiritualism, the belief that communication with the dead is both possible and desirable, spread across the U.S. One of the major factors driving the popularity of spiritualism was war. It was always painful to lose a loved one, but it is especially hard to accept losing a child at a relatively young age. So following both the Civil War and later World War I, there is a tremendous growth in the number of mediums. Spiritualism is also, somewhat ironically, advanced by technology, disruptive technology. In 1900, no one had seen people fly through the air or heard disembodied voices. But by 1920, such sights and sounds were commonplace. If Marconi could project his voice halfway around the globe, why couldn't we tune it into the voices of our dear ones in heaven? Some argued in A Harbinger of X-Men that the increasing number of individuals claiming psychic powers was really just proof of Darwin's theory. If evolution were true, they reasoned, then surely we would witness an increase in the number of people who had mutated to the next level of human development. But spiritualism in the end was about a lot more than science and technology. It was about faith. By the 1920s, proponents had split down two religious paths. Some, calling themselves Christian spiritualists, incorporated their beliefs about mediums and communication with the dead into the rituals of their traditional denominations. Others, like this poster for the Stead Memorial Center, named after a passenger on the Titanic who is said to have made contact after death, developed their own religious doctrines, appointed their own pastors, and formed their own national church organizations. So where does Harry Houdini come into this picture? As Houdini's fame and self-confidence grows, he becomes increasingly cynical about the achievements of other magicians. Robert Houdin had been Eric Weiss's childhood idol, but as a polished performer, he was no longer impressed by his namesake. In 1920, he writes a book called The Unmasking of Robert Houdin. The book not only disparages a magician, but several of Houdini's contemporaries who he considers charlatans. Among these are several prominent mediums. Houdini has been toying with the occult since he was 18, when he went to a medium to try to contact his late father. As I mentioned earlier, he'd even tried to briefly run a seance act of his own. But the book marks his clearest expression of doubt about finding an honest medium. He travels back to England on a book tour that spring and sends advance copies of the book to several prominent authors and thinkers across Britain. One is sent to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle is intrigued and invites Houdini to lunch, inaugurating a brief, if improbable, friendship. I say improbable, not in reference to the differences in class and ethnicity, though the relationship between Harry and Sir Arthur seems like a precursor to the unlikely friendship of Prince Harry and Meghan. No, it's improbable because while Harry Houdini, the master of the magical reveal, was deeply skeptical of spiritualism, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the master of logical reveal, was a strong proponent of the faith. It's sort of like watching Spock fall in love while Kirk plays chess. I thought that would be a reference that could be understood in this room. To be fair, Doyle's full commitment to spiritualism happens long after most of Sherlock Holmes' series has been published. He is deeply affected by his personal losses in the First World War. Among others, he loses both his brother and his son to pneumonia in 1918, a disease they acquired in convalescence from the battlefield. For 2 years after their initial meeting, they carry on chummy correspondence until the summer of 1922, when Sir Arthur and Lady Conan Doyle come to visit the Houdinis in New York. By this time, Sir Arthur is inclined to see the power of spirits everywhere, insisting that Houdini has supernatural powers, despite Houdini's protestations that everything he does, including giving the appearance of walking through a solid brick wall, is a matter of technique and training. Sir Arthur also believes that his second wife, Lady Jean Conan Doyle, is a genuine medium, and during their New York stay, he arranges a seance for the Houdinis. Lady Jean's specialty is not knocks or spirit horns or voices, but rather something called automatic writing. Lady Jean claims to be possessed by the spirit she is trying to reach, who moves her arm to write out a message to the loved one. Jean offers to contact Cecilia Weiss and dutifully records her message to her son. Harry notices a few problems with the message. First, the message begins with the sign of the cross, and he's pretty sure that his mother would not have endorsed that. Second, even though it's his mother's birthday, she says nothing about it, which apparently was rather atypical of his mother. And most importantly, the message is in perfect idiomatic English, well beyond Cecilia's talents, at least while she lived in this world. So for a while, Harry doesn't know what to do. Does he tell the truth and end a friendship or remain silent? 3 months after his meeting with the Doyles, he publishes an article saying that he has not yet found a medium whose work could be validated. After this, Doyle is offended and parts ways with Houdini. So over the next 3 years, Harry redoubles his efforts to expose mediums. His pattern was to send out agents in advance of his arrival in a city, to scope out the performances of the most prominent spiritualists in the community. Once he had figured out their routine, he would show up in disguise. He would often bring a reporter with him, just to ensure that his message would be delivered. Ken Silverman, in his 1996 biography of Houdini, offers the example of Mrs. Cecil Cook, pastor of the Stead Memorial Center in New York. Houdini shows up dressed as in the slide above, accompanied by a gentleman from the Herald Tribune and a policewoman, obviously not identifying them as who they were. When the seance gets underway, Houdini pretends to be hard of hearing, forcing Mrs. Cook to make the voice of the dearly departed son, Alfred, a little louder than the normal whisper. When she starts to channel Alfred's voice, Houdini pulls a flashlight out of his jacket and shines it on Mrs. Cook before she has a chance to remove the spirit horn from her lips, and she screams out, "Who is this rascal?" Harry Houdini delivers his favorite line, "I am Houdini and you are a fraud," and not only watches Mrs. Cook's arrest, but testifies at her trial. So from 1922 onward, Houdini made his exposure of mediums a regular part of his public performances as well. Arthur Moses, author of Houdini Speaks Out, has actually obtained a copy of the Lantern Show that Houdini would present, both at his stage events and during intermissions at theaters that showed his silent films. For any young people in the audience, lantern shows were the original PowerPoint presentations, except that they used glass slides rather than digital media. Moses even has the details of Houdini's script that would accompany the show. It had 3 basic elements. By the way, the exhibit features one of the rare recordings of Houdini's voice, which I won't try to imitate because I can't go that high. So the one element is a rather hollow protest that his attacks were on phonies rather than spiritualism. Before I go any further, I would like to be thoroughly understood that I'm not trying to attack spiritualism. I'm not a skeptic. My mind is wide open, followed by, but I've never seen or heard anything that would cause me to believe that it's possible to communicate with those who've gone before. Second, there would be an attack on the religious legitimacy of spiritualist pastors. Why a reverend of the spiritualist religion means nothing. An Orthodox minister must study at least 8 to 18 years. He must spend thousands of dollars and must pass grueling examinations. All you have to do to be a spiritualist minister is to say, I hear voices and I see forms. Finally, there's a defense of his own character. When I walk into a seance room, they say, here comes the disturbing element. I am no disturbing element. I am willing to believe. But if a man says, I'm a great violin player, you say, let me hear him play. So Houdini's most publicized role was as a member of the team of judges for the Scientific American competition to find a genuine medium. The competition, originally suggested by Doyle in a meeting with the editorial board of the magazine in late 1922, this was clearly a different era for Scientific American, offered a substantial prize to any genuine medium. Malcolm Bird, the magazine's editor, assembled 4 respected scientists, and because of his reputation as a debunker, added Harry to the team. Throughout 1923, they dismissed one potential candidate after another until Bird announced in 1924 that he thought he had found the real thing. Mina Crandon, wife of prominent surgeon Dr. Leroy Crandon, was a Boston society lady who lived at number 10 Lime Street in fashionable Beacon Hill. She was also a medium who, when the spirits moved her, transformed into Marjorie, a conduit to a prankster spirit named Walter, said to be the spirit of Mrs. Crandon's dead brother, killed in a railway accident. Marjorie had a reputation for doing seances in scanty clothing or no clothing at all. Harry strongly suspected that she was looking for opportunities to compromise her investigators. When the Scientific American team came to test her, she invited them all to stay overnight. Only Harry refused. On a second visit that excluded Harry, the 4 scientists were ready to give Marjorie the prize. Houdini rushed back to Boston with what he called a Marjorie box, a device designed to constrain the movement of Marjorie's legs as well as her arms. Sure enough, Marjorie was unable to contact Walter when she was in the box, and would subsequently be revealed that she had made a connection outside the spirit world with Malcolm Bird, the editor running the competition. For more on the Witch of Lime Street, I encourage you to come to the Jewish Museum on July 1, when David Jahir will speak about his fascinating book on this topic. In 1925, Congressman Sol Bloom of New York introduces an anti-fortune-telling bill aimed at the mediums in D.C., and clearly to draw national attention to the problem as well. His star witness, unsurprisingly, is Harry Houdini. This was a tough job because Washington was, well, Washington. Houdini confides in Walter Lippmann that the Coolidges hold seances at the White House, and that Houdini is seeking proof of this. The White House firmly denies the allegations. Mrs. Harding, they admit, had visited mediums, but they insist that there's no truth to the rumors that President Coolidge is consulting the spirit world. At the hearing, an elderly congressman from North Carolina claimed he had never heard of Houdini. He asked the chairman's permission to inquire who he was and whether he was an astrologist. Houdini responded that he was a syndicated writer and author, and I'm a mystifier, which means I'm an illusionist. You don't claim to be able to do anything by divine power? The congressman continued. No, sir, I'm human, but mediums are trying to say that I'm psychic. That's not true. I do tricks, but I do tricks nobody can explain. Learning that Houdini headed the Society of American Magicians, the congressman asked whether it was a secret organization, and if so, it had foreign branches, for instance, in Russia, hinting at Bolshevik connections. Not in Russia, Houdini replied, which I suppose makes Houdini 93 years ago among the first to claim no collusion. Houdini was also attacked by the National Spiritualist Association, which called him a pronounced atheist and infidel. You know, when I started the project, someone asked me, did anyone really know Houdini was Jewish in his own lifetime? So let me share one of the medium's testimonies in reference to Houdini and Representative Bloom. Quote, 3,000 years ago or 2,000, Judas betrayed Christ. He was a Jew, and I want to say that this bill is being put through by 2, well, you can use your own opinion. I'm not making any assertion, unquote. Yeah. Marjorie would later claim that she told Harry Houdini he would die within a year for having humiliated her. But it wasn't Marjorie's curse that killed Houdini. And it wasn't a failed water torture trick, as in the Tony Curtis movie. And it wasn't even J. Gordon Whitehead, the McGill University student who punched Houdini unexpectedly following a performance in Montreal. No, the man principally responsible for the early death of Harry Houdini is, in my view, Harry Houdini. Rather than seeking treatment for his ruptured appendix, Harry continued on tour for 4 days until collapsing on the stage in Detroit. Houdini actually dies on October 31st, 1926, a full 9 days after being hit in the stomach. The monument in Machpelah Cemetery speaks to the dual identity of Houdini and Weiss. Harry Houdini is a recipient of the first broken wand ceremony at his gravesite, the broken wand being a symbol that the magic of the individual has also died. This ceremony, repeated each year at his gravesite on his yahrzeit, the anniversary of his death on the Jewish calendar. Looking at the image, I couldn't help but notice the detail that lists Harry as president of the Society of American Magicians to 1927, a pretty special feat for someone who died in 1926. Re-elected to a 9th term in July of 1926, his term didn't end until 1927, but perhaps this was also a sly way of suggesting that Harry's influence reached beyond the grave. Which leads me to what may be the most ironic part of this Houdini story. The seances to try to reach the spirit of Houdini that are held each year on the anniversary of his death on the secular calendar, that would be Halloween, since the 1930s. The official Houdini seance originally involved his wife, Bess, who allegedly kept a secret message that Houdini promised he would deliver as proof of contact with the other side. Today, the annual official seance involves a gathering of prominent magicians and Houdini scholars, like this one at the Center for Jewish History in New York. This Halloween, they're scheduled to come to the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I assure you that I will let you know if we hear from Harry. There are at least 3 reasons we've established for Houdini's Last Crusade. 1, professional pride. Houdini relished being the smartest man in the room, and exposing mediums provided him with ample opportunity to show how clever he was. 2, an ethical distinction. Houdini was quick to observe that people who came to see him knew they were being tricked and paid for the privilege of being tricked. He viewed this as categorically different from tricking people into paying for false hopes and sham religion. 3, the one that usually makes it into pop culture, is that Houdini was simply upset about not being able to reach his mother. As we've seen, the incident with Lady Doyle really does intensify Houdini's efforts, but in his writings, Houdini is skeptical about spiritualism long before the death of his mother. I'm going to speculate on a possible reason number 4, a reason that emerges less from Houdini than from Weiss. And this requires me to explore in little depth the Jewish attitude toward spiritualism. How does contact with the spirits of the dead fit into the Jewish theological view? How might being Jewish have influenced Houdini's stance toward spiritualism? Not a simple question easily answered in the 10 minutes I have left. But one of my favorite rabbinic stories attempts to answer the question of why the Torah begins with the word Bereshit, starting with the letter Bet or B, rather than the letter Aleph or A. According to this story, it's based on the shape of the letter. The message is, don't look up and worry about heaven. Don't look down and worry about hell. Don't look back and ask what came before God. Only one direction is open for study, and that, since Hebrew is read from right to left, the direction is in the reading everything that follows in the Torah. It's a great story. This is just one of many stories told about Bet, but I think it reflects a fundamental difference between Judaism and the other Abrahamic religions. Judaism puts relatively low priority on the world after death or the rewards and punishments of the afterlife. Deuteronomy chapter 18 warns against polluting Judaism with foreign ideas, including sorcery, necromancy, and explicitly something called Yidei Oni, a person who gains information from ghosts, which, by the way, is a pretty clear indication that mediums were not really invented in the 1840s, but have been with us for thousands of years. Throughout history, there have been multiple Jewish opinions about what happens when we die. Back in the 1st century AD, this led to one of the major disputes between the pro-Great Temple Party, known as the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. The Sadducees rejected the notion of resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees insisted on it. Of course, with the destruction of the great temple, the Sadducees lost the debate by default. And by the Middle Ages, in the time of Maimonides, the belief that the dead would rise up at the end of days had become a core Jewish principle. Though debate continued about exactly who would be resurrected and whether this would happen during or after the Messianic age. This is not to claim that Judaism is bereft of superstition. My grandmother was always worried about the evil eye, a vengeful spirit that was brought out by the jealousy of your success. She favored spitting when someone boasted of an accomplishment that might attract the gaze of the eye. The Hamsa symbol that you often see in a Jewish context is intended as protection from the evil eye. Jewish folklore, which one might distinguish from Jewish faith, is also populated with demons and ghosts. The Dybbuk, for example, is a wandering soul that loses its way after death and attaches itself to the body of a living person. While these superstitions exist, they come in a very different context than in Christianity. Most Jews reject the idea of Satan or the devil on the grounds that it violates the notion of the singularity of God, arguably the most fundamental precept in Judaism. Wandering souls can fit into a Jewish framework, but the Manichaean notion of a dualistic struggle between good and evil is well beyond the pale for most of Jewish history. That is, beyond the pale, except perhaps for the form of Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah. Famous for its extensive search for hidden meanings in words and numbers, it seems that Kabbalah not only traffics in the magical, but at least flirts with dualistic concepts. This is beyond my area of expertise, as I'm well able to reflect. I have not studied Kabbalah, but I found nothing in Houdini's background to suggest he had any attachment to either Hasidism or any other sect that followed or prescribed the teachings of the Kabbalah. So at the end of the day, I'm left with the question of what, if anything, connects Houdini's Jewish background to his decision to take up the cause of exposing mediums. I do not mean to suggest, as his critics did, that Houdini undertook his campaign due to an anti-Christian bias. Rather, I think it was Houdini's position outside the mainstream of America, a position inherent in his Jewish identity, that offered him a clearer view of the deceptive practices of many spiritualists and the motivation to do something about it. My old rabbi and Chicago civil rights leader, Robert Marks, used to refer to the special perspective of American Jews as the interstitial man. People who live in the spaces in between simply see the world differently than people who grow up in a majority culture. Houdini transformed himself from a poor immigrant to a superstar, but in the end, his Jewish identity was truly inescapable. He had been raised without an expectation that the dead went off to a better place or suffered eternal damnation. He had neither Santa Claus nor Lazarus in his religious framework, and no traditions of ghostly apparitions. He believed that the most amazing things could be brought about in this world through study, hard work, and determination. And underneath the layers of his disguise, I would make the case, was a voice calling out, "I'm Eric Weiss, and I know a fraud when I see one." So thanks for hearing my story. I'm indebted to these sources and my colleague David London.